Hi, second grade friends. Today's story is from Knowledge 5, Lesson 6, called Broad Stripes and Bright Stars. Before we begin our read aloud, I'm going to introduce our vocabulary words. Our first vocabulary word for today's story is the word confident. Repeat after me. Confident. Confident means believing you can do something. Our next vocabulary word is the word inspired. Say inspired. Inspired means to cause someone to do or think something, especially something creative. Our last vocabulary word is the word withdrew. Say withdrew. Withdrew means to move away or back off from a place. What happened after the British left Washington? Asked Adele, as she looked down at her grandfather from the highest hay bale. As you can imagine, Grandfather Lafitte replied, the British were feeling very confident. They had defeated the U.S. Army in Washington and destroyed the capital. They planned to capture Baltimore next, which at the next time was a very important port. What's a port? Asked Adele. A port is a town or a city where ships stop to load and unload cargo. Baltimore was a deep-water port, meaning that the water was deep enough for really big ships to sail in and dock there. Baltimore was a port where ships could send and receive goods such as flour, tobacco, and sugar. Besides that, Baltimore is a central location between New York and Philadelphia to the north, and Washington to the south. But for the British, it would provide a place to land a huge invading army. So if the British destroyed the capital and then captured Baltimore, they would gain an advantage, said JP. That's right, said Grandfather Lafitte. Capturing Baltimore was a key part of the British plan. From there, they hoped to attack other important cities, but I'll tell you what actually had happened. The Battle of Baltimore can be divided into two parts. The battles on land, and the battles at sea. The British general in charge of the attack on Washington, D.C. thought that they could all capture Baltimore as easy as they did the capital. Oh boy, sighed JP. These cats are even interested in the story too. At that moment, a second barn cat had come to join the first one. The second one was attempting to sit on JP's chest. That's not what happened though, continued Grandfather Lafitte. The people of Baltimore knew that the British were coming, and they prepared themselves for a fight. A commander of the U.S. Army ordered that a huge earth bank called entrenchments be built along the eastern side of the city. They knew that the British soldiers would have to begin their attack there. Sure enough, one September morning, the British landed several thousand soldiers at a place called North Point. What's a entrenchment? Adele repeated the word that she didn't quite understand, as she dangled a long piece of string high above the barn cat's head. Entrenchments are structures created to protect an area and the people in it. Entrenchments can be made by either digging into the ground or by building walls above the ground. The entrenchments acted as a defensive wall and as a means of targeting the advancing army. In addition to building the entrenchments, the army got ready to defend Fort McHenry. Was the purpose of Fort McHenry to protect Baltimore's harbor? Asked JP. Yes, Fort McHenry was a defensive fort located right at the bay. It was built in the shape of a five-pointed star. Soldiers were perched on the tip of each star point to protect the fort from all directions. The U.S. Army knew that they had to try to keep the British soldiers out, or they would surely lose. The British soldiers began to advance on the city. They kept coming until they were finally pushed back by a large U.S. Army. Did the British give up? Asked JP. Not yet, replied Grandfather Lafitte. They withdrew and set up camp. The next morning, the battle continued. The British marched right up to the entrenchments at North Point. This time, they didn't just face a larger U.S. Army, but lots of cannons and other weapons too. The British quickly realized that they were outgunned. They retreated, and we won the battle at North Point. What happened at Fort McHenry? Asked Adele. Now that's quite a story, said Grandfather Lafitte, as he laughed quietly. The people of Baltimore had imagined that they were in for a long, hard fight, and so they prepared for one. Besides building entrenchments, they stored supplies. They even sank some of their own ships so that the British would not be able to sail into the harbor. They sank their own ships? Asked JP, astonished. Yes, they did, explained Grandfather. Another important part of preparation included the creation of a new flag for Fort McHenry. The commander of the fort, George Armstead, wanted a flag so big that the British sailors would be able to see it from far away. A lady named Mary Pickersgill was asked to make the flag. I read a book about this once, said Adele. Mary Pickersgill needed help to make such a big flag. She did indeed, replied Grandfather Lafitte. Her daughter, her two nieces, and a young apprentice all helped. The flag that these 5 women made had 15 stars and 15 stripes. When it was finished, the flag was as large as a house, and it was actually bigger than the room they were making it in. Mary Pickersgill's flag measured 30 feet tall by 42 feet wide. It was carried to the fort and would later be hung on a giant flagpole. Do you know how many stars and stripes our flag has today? There are 13 stripes and 15 stars, JP said confidently. The 13 stripes represents the 13 original colonies, and the stars represent our 50 states. Excellent, exclaimed Grandfather Lafitte. Now let's get back to the story. Before long, the British began firing rockets at Fort McHenry. At first, the British ships were too far from the fort for the U.S. soldiers to be able to return fire. For more than 24 hours, the British pounded on the fort. With little return fire, the British ships sailed closer and closer to the fort. Once they were close enough, though, our soldiers were able to return the fire. That must have sounded like a terrible thunderstorm, said Adele. Probably louder than fireworks on the 4th of July, added JP. Did we hit any British ships? Asked JP. We sure did, said Grandfather Lafitte. In fact, the British ships were forced to pull back. They kept firing, though. However, early the next morning, the British realized that they had not been able to take over the city. They stopped the attack, and the British ships sailed away. During the night, the fort had flown a smaller flag, but as soon as the British stopped firing and prepared to sail away, the commander, George Armstead, directed the army to raise the enormous flag that Mary Pickersgill and her helpers made. Wow, exclaimed JP and Adele together. Grandfather added, a man named Francis Scott Key watched the whole battle that night from a boat just outside of Baltimore. He saw bombs shooting through the air and watched the rockets rain down all through the day and into the night. And as the sun came up, Francis Scott Key was still on the boat. When he saw that enormous flag flying, he knew that Baltimore had been saved. The United States won the battle. Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem, exclaimed JP. That's right. The events that morning inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem that later became our national anthem, added Grandfather Lafitte. Come on, JP, announced Adele. Let's sing the national anthem for Granddad. The 2 children stood up in a warm sunshine and looked at their grandfather. Together they sang the words that Francis Scott Key was inspired to write that morning so long ago. Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? When the children were finished, Grandfather Lafitte smiled proudly at them. With his hands around their shoulders, he said, why don't we head back up to the house for a late afternoon snack? You might even hear something about those pirates, too. Sounds good to me, said Adele as she scrambled down from the hay bales. Ooh, pirates, exclaimed JP. Then together the 3 walked back towards the house with their 2 furry friends at their heels.